And thank you, Kelly, for memories. It's good. That's part of what we're doing here with ending this Family Life series today. And I want to say thank you, friends, for not giving up on church. You're not giving up on church. Sometimes you got to fight a little harder for things. And I'm not just talking to people here in person, but I'm talking for those of you on live stream. You're not giving up on church. Thank you. So I own that Thanksgiving is going to look quite different this year for many of us, including me. And that this Thanksgiving message will also be considerably different. So this fall, our preaching themes have been centered around family life. And today I'm concluding that series with a very un-Thanksgiving-like topic of ending life or ending life well. But amid these strange times and un-Thanksgiving-like feelings, I offer this first slide, this passage. We have hope because the steadfast love of the Lord never, never, never ceases. And it's not ironic that this is in the book of Lamentations. There's hope here in the middle of Lamentations. There's hope in the middle of our laments and the things and the people and the situations that are diminishing or are lost or are different. Hear the writer. I have hope because the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. God's mercies never come to an end, even if we don't see or feel them. The mercies of God are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness, God. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in God. Happy Thanksgiving, friends. Happy Thanksgiving. We have hope. So I find today's Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8 text fascinating and relevant. So this past Wednesday at Bible study, I asked the group, and yeah, there's actually an in-person, we're safely masked and distanced, in-person Bible study on Wednesday at 6:30. So I asked the group to reflect on this Ecclesiastes 3 passage, and so I have a couple thoughts here. I just invited, what do you think when you hear that Ecclesiastes 3 passage? Someone wrote, it kind of sounds like a psalm or a proverb. They also added, the context of there is a time for everything is hugely important. Another person in the Bible study noted, the time to mourn and the time to dance, that really needs to be done in community. That's a good Anabaptist answer, right? Needs to be done in community. Another person wrote, their perspective from this Ecclesiastes passage was, you are not in charge. People are not in charge. Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 through 2 read, for everything there is a season and a time, for every matter under heaven, time to be born and a time to die. And skipping, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. That's now, right? Now's not the time for a lot of embracing, at least with people out of your bubble, right? A time to keep silence and a time to speak. So the next slide I have this morning. For everything, there is a season. A time to be born and a time to die. So I took this picture this week. There's a tree in the backyard that no longer has leaves. And it made me think of this poem. And this poem, to me, speaks not just of death, but also of life. Colorful trees losing their leaves. Beauty on the ground. Splendor bowed. Magnificence submitted. Gifts surrendered. Laid before the Lord. Empty before our Creator. Alone. Bare. Exposed. Vulnerable. Sad. But no, you will rise again. Life from death, hope from hopelessness, joy from depression. You will return in beauty, in splendor, in magnificence. I think in discussions of death, it is also helpful and important to talk about life, like this poem about trees. Yes, things seem bare and alone, but life, new life, will come. And I think for Christians, when we talk of death and or end of life issues, we also cannot forget to talk about new life as well. After my wife Naomi died, I drew strength from imaging her in heaven, continuing to live in eternity. And I can imagine her saying to me, Jess, live. Keep living. I am. Jess, I am being taken care of. So let's talk about end of life. And so the next slide I have this morning. Do you want to end life well? Do you want to not only live well, but die well too? And I'm going to reference this book that you see there by Dr. Glenn Miller, Living Thoughtfully, Dying Well. I know some of you have seen it, and I think it's a great resource, and I'm going to pull out some things this morning. I also want to add that just talking about death or end-of-life issues does not mean it's going to happen soon. Don't be superstitious. As a believer in the power of a risen Savior, we could talk about death. We don't have to fear it. And let's not get all tight and rigid about that. So I like what's in Miller's book here in the beginning, the preface. It's written here. The best way to avoid a bad death is to plan for a good death. This includes being able to be at peace with God, your family and friends, and to leave this life without substantial regrets. It also means that you plan ahead with your family and physician so that you will receive only the types of medical care that you agree to in advance. And you'll hear a little more about that. Miller also writes in his book, preparation starts with an awareness of one's mortality. And that means we all die sometime. We all die sometime, whether we talk about it or not. There is a time to die. Now, we'd like to have more time, and we'd like to have a little more control over that maybe, but there is an end. Another thing Miller brings out in his book, he says, there are worse things than death. He writes this. Dr. Miller writes, I had cared for patients who had physically survived but were left with severe mental impairment. He writes of Marvin, who's transferred back to my care from an out-of-town cardiac arrest and now was in a persistent, eye-wide-open, vigilant state, looking like he was about to wake up, but never would. Or octogenarian Maynard, who suffered multiple broken ribs in the resuscitation efforts and remained unconscious and on a ventilator for 4 days until he died. Miller continues, less dramatic, but no less tragic, are the persons with the gradual onset of dementia. I recall the daughter who faithfully recited the news to her silent and confused mother who comprehended nothing. Miller writes, it was clear to me there are things worse than death. Another concept that I'm struck by, Miller brings out, dying has become a process with multiple options to consider. And he says it hasn't always been that way. He says, you can have too much medical care. And he writes, more medical care is not always better. The process of dying has changed due to medical technology and life support devices. And he's not against these things, right? There's a time and a place for them, but there's a time and a place not to use them. He writes, there are now more options for treatment that require decisions. As organs fail, decisions about life-extending measures need to take into account the elderly patient's quality of life. This is particularly true in cases of dementia and failing cognitive ability. Miller advocates for us to be informed and to allow that to be part of the end-of-life process, of the planning process. And I want to say, I'm just scratching the surface on this book. And I encourage you to, if this is stirring something in you, to pay attention to it and seek after reading this book and getting more information. Last thing that I want to draw out from this book is Miller writes about his experience with his sister and her end-of-life process, which was healthy. And then he says from that, this is what he learned. He says, get a proper diagnosis, if at all possible, and then trust it. Go with it. He also brings out, explore your treatment options. What can or can't be done? He also writes, maintain a realistic attitude toward interventions. Be realistic. Age, the illness that you're dealing with are all part of those. And then I like this. He says, with his sister, he writes, plan for the time remaining. Organize the caregiving. Create good memories. May walking this journey together be a bonding time for your family rather than a negative. So next slide. So I learned about dying well from Naomi. I experienced firsthand how planning can help one die well. Naomi and I got the best diagnosis we could, and then in faith in Jesus, we lived into that. That meant we didn't scurry around for every option. And yet early on in the process, I committed to meeting Naomi with the treatment options that she wanted, that she was comfortable with, supporting her in that. And I'll say, yeah, I had some regrets. One of the grief books I read, they said, no matter how you die with a loved one, or how your loved one dies and you walk that journey, there will be some regrets in some way. And they say, name them and release them and don't carry those. So I appreciated Naomi's realistic attitude about interventions. I remember after her brain surgery, she had a glioblastoma tumor that they were able to remove. The surgeon said 95% of that. But there's still so many unknowns with that. But the realistic attitude that Naomi had was, she said, we need to go into the hospital and we need to make sure the DNR is filled out, that do not resuscitate. She needed to make sure the power of attorney, all those things were in place. And I remember as we were in this process, setting this up, at one point, I think she might have forgot who she was with, but she looked at me and she said, you know, Jess, if you can't do these things for me at the end of life, I'll get the kids to do it. And I chuckled because like that would have been easier for my daughters, Marie and Grace and Anna. Not that it was easy for me, but I had a few more years and I recognized that. But I respect the fact that she wanted to plan that. And one thing in this whole process, she didn't know how much time we had. We thought we'd have 1 to 2 years, and so we were planning for that, and it ended up being 5 months. So there was a shift in the time with that. But I appreciate that she made clearly when I die, I want to die at home, surrounded by family. And because she was clear about that, and because we did it sooner rather than later, we were able to set that in place. And that helped then with creating better memories and walking the journey together with family members. And the ability to organize the caregiving so that other people could be involved with Naomi's end-of-life process. And that was important to her. She didn't just want family to help her. She wanted friends to help as well. Now, Naomi gave me another gift. This is a little less direct, but yes, it is. Still direct. So I remember this would have been maybe a week after her brain surgery. And we were in the backyard in our house in Ohio, and we were swinging on the hammock. So we were sitting there lying beside, cuddled up. And at one point in the swinging of the hammock, she turned to me and she said, Jess, when I'm gone, you need to remarry. So we're swinging on the hammock. And I said, stop it. I'm a grown man. When that time comes, I will figure that out. So we're swinging on the hammock some more. After a little while, she looks at me and she says, you know, Jess, I've got some ideas for you. I turned and said, stop. Now's not the time to be thinking about that. We swung a little bit more. Then I turned to her and said, who are you thinking about? She told me. We laughed. we let it go. But the gift she gave me was she knew me and she released me to remarry if I wanted to, knowing that was important for me. As you all know, you've not met Naomi, but Kay has. But I'm married to Kendra, and I can live into that without having to think of disloyalty or other kinds of thoughts that can keep you from living. So the last slide I have this morning. So this has us take a peek at this Peter passage that was also referenced and read this morning. I also believe Peter wanted to die well. What did dying well mean for him? And then how might dying well mean for you? Maybe you hear something in this message that you want to latch on to think about, or to process. But in verse 14, 2 Peter, he writes, or at least dictates, "For since I know that my death will come soon, as indeed our Lord Jesus Christ has made it clear to me. And I will make every effort so that after my departure, you may be able at any time to recall these things." So I add some things in there. He planned for a good death. He made some efforts. He wasn't superstitious about end of life. I think he just knew. And sometimes you know. And he made some plans. Now, I also think he wasn't just talking about DNRs and power of attorneys and those kind of things. But I think there were things that he wanted to pass on. So I also asked the Bible study, what would you like to pass on? Someone wrote, I want people to remember that I lived a life that honored God, that I lived to grow God's kingdom while I lived. And this person wrote, I also want to be remembered that he was imperfect, but he tried. That's realistic. I like that. Another person wanted to be remembered as having a heart for others, have the heart of a servant, that they loved others, not just the people in their own family, that people would remember that. So those were some thoughts. And there are others, and I think that points to the question here. How might dying well look for you? Yeah, there's the specific plans, but what are the relationship things that you want to pass on? And I know for me, I want people to remember me as a person who was grateful, who said thank you a lot, who lived that way. Many of you don't know, but there are times in my life where I was particularly sarcastic and negative. And I can be prone, or I've had in the past times of being fatalistic. But don't want to be remembered for that. I want to be remembered as someone who can be thankful, who can embrace gratitude and gratefulness. So there's much more that can be said about end-of-life issues and or hopes, things you want to pass on. And I just want to say, I encourage you to continue those conversations. Talk about that with people of all ages. What are your hopes and dreams? Marie reminded me this week that when she was growing up, her mom and I would say, we talk about, if something would happen to us, and never in our wildest dreams did we think that one of us would die younger. But it did happen. And so I am glad that we've had those conversations. I remember one of the things I said was, if I die young, don't build an altar and have my picture and all that stuff there sitting in the main room for the rest of your life. Don't do that. I said, you can cry at my funeral. I'm okay with that. But keep living. And Marie reminded me, even back then, Naomi said to them, oh, Dad will have to get married again. And so even then, she was giving me that gift. I want to close this morning with a poem about grief that's particularly strong for me. And then I'll come back and give a benediction after the song. Do not hurry as you walk with grief. Do not hurry as you walk with death. It does not help the journey. Walk slowly, pausing often. Do not hurry as you walk with grief and death. Be not disturbed by memories that come unbidden. Swiftly forgive. And let Christ speak for your unspoken words. Unfinished conversation will be resolved in Him. Be not disturbed. Be gentle with the one who walks with grief and death. If it is you, be gentle with yourself. Swiftly forgive. Walk slowly, pausing often. Take time. Be gentle as you walk with grief and death.